Welcome to Media Empires, where we sit down with the most influential media creators right now to learn exactly how they built their empires. Our aim is to extract the secrets of top-tier podcasters, newsletter authors, and media creators who are breaking the old rules for media success. Whether you're looking to start your own empire or simply curious about the nuts and bolts behind media businesses, you'll find valuable insights and tactics in each episode. Grab your headphones, let's dive in.
This week on Media Empires, I'm joined by Rex Woodbury. He's the founder and managing partner at Daybreak Ventures, and previously was a partner at Index Ventures. In this conversation recorded in 2023, we discussed the evolution of the creator economy, the impact of technology on commerce, and monetization challenges for creators. Rex, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining again.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and I always enjoy our conversations, Erik. So hopefully we can, have another one of riffing on a lot of the shared interests that we have.
Amazing. So I'll start with a thought experiment, Rex. Let's say that we're having a conversation in 2012, and Rex from 2023, can join in the conversation. They're saying, "Hey, Erik, Rex from 2012, here's what the creator economy is, and here's what's happened in the next 11 years." What is sort of the bullet points that you would emphasize that would be most enlightening or illuminating to Rex and Erik of 2012?
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I think probably right around 2012 was when YouTube came up with the word creator. And so they had this idea that, they were trying to think about the next generation of media. And this was only a few years after, I think, Barry Diller, who I respect greatly, and for those who don't know, has been sort of this pioneer in both traditional media as sort of CEO of, I think, Fox and Paramount in the 20th century, but then the founder of IAC, which has incubated Tinder and Match Group and Expedia and all these great companies in the internet age. He made this comment in 2006 or 7 that said, basically, talent is finite. There aren't people in their bedrooms with talent that's waiting to be unlocked. Only so many people can move culture and move media the way that celebrities and stars do. And it is a comment that has not aged well, because it turned out that there were a lot of people sort of in their bedrooms waiting for distribution to unlock their creativity. And then 2012 was when YouTube was sort of figuring out what to call this next generation. They weren't necessarily movie stars or actors, but they were this burgeoning creative class. And so they called them creators. To answer your question, I mean, what would I say to myself or you 11 years ago? I mean, I think I would say the broader trend is just this idea of the internet being a place that you can better unleash self-expression and creativity and remove gatekeepers. And then the second piece is what really interests me about the creator space, but also just technology broadly, is kind of what I call digitally native jobs. Like, what is this idea that you actually have alternative options to the 9-to-5, the monolithic career that dominated culture and our lives for the last 100, 200 years. And YouTube's an example, TikTok, Roblox, a lot of places that I would consider creator platforms. You can actually make a living on these. And so 2012 was probably the early onset of a lot of those options for people.
Those are some great nuggets. What if the 2012 versions of ourselves asked, "Hey, Rex, why don't you share more about how commerce has evolved? You've written a bunch about this recently. What are some of the big ways commerce happens online?"
The reasons I like words like creator and commerce is I think of them in much broader definitions than I think the sort of tech buzzwords do. I actually think a lot of the traditional quote unquote creator economy companies aren't actually great businesses. There are only so many link in bio startups you need, or creator CRMs. But when you think of it broadly, thinking of our index portfolio, I consider Roblox, which is also a gaming company, to be a creator company. Figma is a B2B SaaS company, but it's also a tool that unleashes a lot of creativity. Same with Canva. So I think of the broad aperture, and commerce in a similar way. I mean, commerce is a $26 trillion global industry. It's only about 10 or 15% penetrated online now. And so it really we live in this consumer society where for millennia now we've been transacting with each other, and it started with trading, cows and wheat and things like that. One fun fact is that the Latin word for money, pecunia, actually comes from pecus, which means cow, because that was one of the early forms of currency. But the real shift over time has just been, one, this trend to technology, of course, and so more retail coming online. But then the way I think about commerce is this arc toward more convenient, more affordable, and better quality. And I think, the power with technology has always shifted to the consumer. And so in 2023, you and I have a much better shopping experience online than we did in 2012. And I think in 2034, another 11 years into the future, it'll be even more convenient, affordable, and high quality.
I think one thing that would also shock us from a decade ago is your idea of the billionaire creator. That, as say, hypothetically, there's going to be this 25-year-old kid or however old he is from North Carolina who just records videos all day. He's mastered YouTube, and he then built additional businesses on top of whether it's a commerce company, Feastables, or a venture fund, or other things. Just this idea of how big the biggest creators could be would shock us.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Beast is an incredible story, on the blurring of the lines between creator and commerce. I mean, Rihanna just performed at the Super Bowl recently, and the Oscars. Fenty is an incredible success story. Kim Kardashian's Skims is an incredible success story. So I think what's interesting is the internet has blown open distribution, and so it's changed how people can get products in front of others. And the best brands kind of both find an innovation around. Skims is actually really interesting in that it had this innovation that shapewear is outerwear. Fenty was very inclusive from the get-go with different shades of makeup. So they did have net new product innovations, but they also had this advantage of celebrity distribution. And I think one of the most interesting trends of the last kind of 50 or 60 years is this shift of where people place their trust. And it used to be in corporations and institutions. At first it was the government and NASA, and then later it was corporations like Microsoft and Google, and the people that people looked up to were your Bill Gateses and Mark Zuckerbergs. And now it's really a lot of these kind of online digitally native personalities, whether it's Rihanna or Kim or Emma Chamberlain or Mr. Beast. But it's interesting just to see who the arbiters of taste and culture are and how that's shifting.
And the punchline there is that it's gone more for individuals and institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's been blown open by the internet, allowing anyone to amass and cultivate a community and audience, and then monetize that in new ways. And I love a couple examples would be, Jason at Discord often talks about, there are 19 million active servers on Discord each week. And so that kind of embodies that on the internet, everyone can find a community or belonging in some way. And then the other story I like to tell is what Jack Conti at Patreon says, which is, I might have been someone that grew up in a town of 1,000 people, and I'm the only person who has a certain interest. And so I'm kind of an outsider in that town. But when I go online, there are 5 billion people online, meaning that 5 million people share that very kind of niche interest. And so all of a sudden I found my tribe and I find belonging and community. And I think that's a really elegant and optimistic way to look at the internet. And it's something that keeps me excited about, of course, social media is sort of net positive and negative externalities. But at the end of the day, I think we live in this kind of global, borderless digital world now. And that's very inspiring to me.
Tell ourselves from a decade ago what Gen Z is going to be like, how they're going to be different, and why that's going to matter.
Yeah, I mean, I always joke as an investor who is really fascinated with consumer behavior. And so a lot of the time I spend is thinking around generational behavior shifts. You kind of get into this in-between area where you're no longer, the young up-and-comer yourself, but you don't have kids yet to watch what apps they're downloading and what they're doing on their phone. And so how do you solve that kind of valley in the middle? And the way I do it is trying to talk to young people and just understand how they're thinking about the world. That both is, bothering my cousins to talk to me and have their friends talk to me, but it's also, spending way too much time reading TikTok comments and on subreddits and stuff. And I think what's interested me is this shift of, this is the first true digital native generation that has come of age with smartphones and with social media and being immersed in these digital worlds. And I think that comes with some reactions around backlash to the way of traditional things were done. Also, there are a lot of, different factors outside, like the Great Recession and COVID and student loan debt that have made people very anti-capitalist. But there are a lot of buzzwords I think of when I think of Gen Z, and one is certainly more entrepreneurial and self-directed than prior generations. And the other would be, authentic is an overused buzzword now, but kind of fed up with a lot of the performative nature of social media and trying to find more authentic belonging. So could literally geek out all day about different ways that this manifests, but it is the first kind of digital native generation.
It's fascinating. I see a very sharp kind of bifurcation between. There's a lot of Gen Z that is kind of very into like the mental health, into social justice or activism, into kind of the front lines of some of the biggest social issues today. And then there is a much smaller but still pretty staunch version of Gen Z that is kind of reactionary to the other version of Gen Z. And so you see the rise of Andrew Tate appealing to that young demographic, and some other influencers on the other side appealing very strongly there. But it feels like politics or culture in general is just very important, and less so about like what Congress is doing, but more so about like issues around values and culture and what really matters.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wrote this piece a couple months ago that I think it was called What Gen Z Thinks About Work, College, and the Internet. So it was kind of talking to Gen Zs about different concepts and having quotes from them that I thought were indicative of broader trends. And this one reader responded over email to it. And he basically said the reason that we care so much about social justice and race and these issues is that we feel like it's the only thing that we actually have the agency to change. So it's kind of like, boomers are in charge of government and capitalism and the corporations, and we're fed up. There's not that much we can do about student loan debt and income inequality and abortion, et cetera. And so it was kind of this nihilism almost, or jadedness, or just kind of sheer exhaustion with a lot of those slower moving bureaucratic parts of government. And so it was kind of like, the one thing we can change through the megaphones of social media is, changing things like Black Lives Matter, or even, around gun control. And it was really interesting just to hear that perspective, because I think young people feel kind of a loss of agency in some ways. And that if you look at a chart of how much at different ages, different generations of America have held of national wealth, Gen Z and millennials both hold so little compared to what boomers did at our age. And so it's interesting to think about how does that loss of agency manifest in other ways of trying to find some sense of control and some way to change the world through the means that we know how to.
Totally. Maybe Greta Thunberg is an example of someone who so young has had such a massive impact that maybe 10 years ago, it was harder to imagine something like that, resonating so widely.
Yeah, I mean, I think young people feel like they've inherited this world where that's a great example. It's kind of like climate change is out of control and gun control is a huge issue, and Roe v. Wade is being repealed, and there are global pandemics and this incredible polarization in politics, and it just feels like probably the world is ending. And of course, I think that's exacerbated by having phones in our pocket every day that give us alerts of bad news happening around the world, and the 24/7 news cycle actually being, coming with us and following us at all times. And a lot of the echo chambers of social media exacerbate that as well. But, I think it's very detrimental to young people's mental health.
I'm curious what you think are the biggest questions that we have not yet figured out around the creator economy. Another way of asking that is like, let's say we're talking to ourselves 5 years from now or 8 years from now. What questions do you expect to get answered, or what developments, what almost forks in the road that, are happening within the creator economy?
Yeah, I mean, again, I kind of think of it broadly as what are different ways that people can make a living online and connect and find community. So, it's more around this like broad thread of how is consumer behavior and worldviews intersecting with technology, and what are the ripple effects of that? I mean, to answer your question specifically, I think monetization is a huge issue still, where in certain niches of the online world and digitally native work, you can earn a living if you know how to develop a game on Roblox, or if you know how to manage a Discord server really effectively, or be a YouTuber or TikToker. But I do think that there are a lot of people who have grown up with this digital fluency, but without a way to capitalize on it. So an example would be the most recent investment that we announced at Index is this company called Flagship. And so I met the entrepreneur probably about a year ago now, when he was at Instagram and leaving Instagram, and he'd worked on a lot of the commerce products there. And he basically realized that there was no way for these people with huge profiles online to effectively recommend products and earn income for it. And so there was this big affiliate kind of link mess out there where people were buying things based on other recommendations, but attribution wasn't always correct. And so he built this kind of elegant, along with his Yusuf, along with his co-founders, Khalil and Johanna, built this kind of elegant infrastructure for people with big followings to actually make recommendations to their communities and then earn income when people shop through their stores. So I think that's an interesting example where it goes beyond the kind of, 2015 era sponsored posts like hashtag ad, hashtag paid kind of thing. And it's a much more elegant and scalable and passive way to earn income. And in many ways, it's just a new version of being a boutique store owner. And so just as someone 100 years ago would open, a cute boutique store on the corner of Main Street, now someone can open their boutique online and recommend the things they love and actually earn income from it. So I think that's an example where monetization has been broken. The influence has been uncoupled from the economic opportunity. And this is an example of an elegant business model where it could actually align those incentives and create sustainable new forms of work.
We'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey, everybody. If you don't already subscribe to the Media Empires newsletter, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power this and other Turpentine newsletters is called Beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business. And they built Beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails, from essayists to business owners. The platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. Beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The Beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, Newsletter Operator, and so many more. Beehiiv's founder hooked up Media Empires listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code EMPIRES. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started. Real talk. Most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating a human connection with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes.
A few things I'd add to that. One is, in general, I think a lot of creators probably don't own the communication channel with their audience. Like, they don't have their emails, or they're susceptible to these platforms. And then on the monetization front, I'd agree with what you said. I'd also add that we still haven't quite figured out a scalable way to kind of correspond the monetization with the impact of the influence. Like, some of my favorite artists I've only paid, $10 to, or haven't paid anything to, and yet I'd pay a lot of money for. And similarly, and this was the promise of, or this is the promise, I guess, of NFTs or of Web3, is the idea that you can sort of align intensity of fandom with economic. Like, I have this viewpoint that whoever generates the demand is going to capture the value, and the intensity of the demand is going to correspond with the value capture. And we're still a long ways away from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a major issue still, of like willingness to pay not being captured. And I mean, one of the kind of guiding themes of technology that I think is interesting is when you have mismatched supply and demand, how do you better both match it, but then unlock latent supply? And so, yeah, maybe that's in latent willingness to pay for a creator. Maybe it's I think in retail, it's very interesting around, I think about this a lot in secondhand, actually, where, we're talking from my apartment in New York, which my partner and I moved into about a year ago. And, when we were buying a bunch of goods here, it was kind of, we would go look at an expensive dining table, and of course it's first hand, and we would say, wow, that's expensive, but I bet somewhere in New York City, someone has that dining table and is willing to part with it for a fraction of the price. But how do you actually use technology to better match that demand and find that person and have them find me. And all of the tailwinds behind secondhand are really interesting around sustainability and more affordable retail. And the problem is that it's difficult for software to fix that sort of offline experience of chatting with 37 potential buyers and trying to find someone to come pick up the table and the logistics piece. But I think it kind of is an interesting example of what's the potential in across sectors in the next few years of when someone has a willingness to pay for something, someone has a willingness to part with something or sell something for a certain amount, and how do you better connect those two people?
Say more about that. Is there a company that you want to exist that helps enable that somehow? And if so, what should that look like?
If I knew exactly what the right business model would be, I probably would be, trying to find someone to build it or incubate it. I do think secondhand and resale is very interesting. I mean, there are great companies out there like Archive, which is a company that lets brands own their own kind of secondhand marketplace. So if you go to shop from, North Face, it'll have a pre-loved section where instead of North Face needing to sell a bunch of its goods on Depop or Vinted or ThredUp or a bunch of these secondhand marketplaces, they can control the experience, and it's beneficial for them because they get to acquire this younger, thriftier consumer. I think those are interesting. I think, we're now seeing a lot of resale at checkout, which is interesting because when I go to, buy a new jacket that costs $500, if it says, by the way, like in a year or 2 years, the estimated resale value is 400, then you say, I'm much more willing to convert as a shopper. And a brand will love that because their AOVs will go up and their cart abandonment rates will go down. And so I think things like that are quite interesting, but haven't found exactly the right one around what I'm talking about around unlocking latent supply. I think there's something interesting there, but it's yet to be figured out. And so if anyone's building that, I would love to meet them.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. I'm curious how far this, individuals over institutions could apply. And I'll give you some examples. I was talking to someone on the show the other day who's deep in the NBA, and we were talking about how, it's really about the players. Like, that's why people go to the games. And you can imagine, Lonzo Ball and LeVar Ball tried to, I believe, create a sneaker competitor. Like, why does Nike get all these profits? Why don't the players own equity in the shoe themselves? But you could also take that further to, why don't the players own the ESPN? Like, people want to hear from the players, not from, journalists, not to put down journalists, but then you could also take it even further. Like, why don't players own the NBA? Like, and so there's as technology gets more, democratized, open source, diffuse, and as distribution becomes more and more important. Similarly with Mr. Beast, it's like, okay, you own commerce, like a burger brand, but should you own a Cash App competitor, or God forbid, even a YouTube competitor, like the underlying platform itself? Like, how far do you think the individuals can go?
That's a good question. I think, to your sports example, I mean, the NCAA changed the NIL name, image, and likeness rules. And so you're seeing young people who have that influence be able to monetize it in new ways. And so that's an interesting step in the right direction. At the end of the day, I mean, I do think that the best products win. And so, this is a debate that I had recently with a friend of mine when we were watching the Super Bowl together and Rihanna did her little Fenty spot when she was performing, which was very clever. And we were talking about celebrity brands, and there's this huge graveyard of celebrity brands out there. And his argument was basically that distribution always wins. It's almost unfair that these celebrities have hundreds of millions of followers and can just, spin up some, easy, white labeled manufacturing of a product and then sell it. And my argument was actually, that's not true. I think that consumers are smart and they can suss out whether a product is a good product or not, and whether it's authentic to the creator and to what they want. And the example that we talked about that day was Adidas had just announced, or the Wall Street Journal had announced, that Adidas was going to lose a bunch of money on Beyonce's Ivy Park line. So we were kind of talking about, well, this athleisure line that Beyonce did doesn't really fit with her aspirational aesthetic. Maybe she should have done something in luxury akin to the Tiffany campaign that she did. And so we kind of had this debate around why different brands succeed. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, it comes down to a great product. Could Mr. Beast do a Cash App competitor if he actually was capable of building a better product than Cash App? For sure. Like, he does have the brand recognition and distribution, but Square is full of a bunch of great product managers and designers and engineers who have built a really great product. And, I think at the end of the day, distribution helps, but it's only one half of the equation. Product excellence is really probably the most important place to start.
Totally. And certainly him nor a creator could do that in the same way that, person at Square couldn't be the next Mr. Beast. But what they could do is partner, with an enterprising set of engineers and say, hey, Mr. Beast is going to get 10% or at some minority percentage of this Cash App competitor or, platform competitor. The Shots team tried back in the day to compete with Instagram. And maybe it was they had supported Bieber, et cetera. Maybe it was too early, or maybe it was just too big of a climb. But it'll be interesting to see kind of the intersection of entrepreneurs and creators. And to your, like, we see it on the commerce side already with some big brands, Kylie Jenner, Kim Kardashian, et cetera. But I'm curious to see it in software and curious if that will happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I saw a tweet or a blog post recently that basically said, if the internet if you think about business, it's really you make a product and then you get it in front of people. And the internet reinvented the latter. It reinvented distribution, and we get to obfuscate a bunch of gatekeepers, et cetera. AI and generative AI will reinvent the former, the creation process. And that's interesting to me and to a bunch of people in the venture and startup world, because, if you think about even things like writing code, GitHub Copilot can help you there, writing words and prose, of course, ChatGPT has taken the world by storm. And then images, we've got DALL-E and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, et cetera. And so it is interesting to think about when the creation process is a lot easier and one person or a small handful of teams can do what used to require a ton of engineers and designers and copy editors, et cetera. I mean, that's really interesting around, is it easier to create products? I mean, still my hunch is that, the most talented people can create 10x better products, but it will blow open what it means to build things. And that'll be interesting around what actually happens when the new industrial revolution happens around manufacturing exploding in a new way, maybe like the digital version of that, software exploding in a new way.
Do you have any requests for startups yet in the generative AI space or anything you're particularly looking at with your venture hat on?
It's a good question. I think it's still very early in the application layer, which is where I spend most of my time. I also think it's going to be interesting to see who wins and who can actually build defensibility in. I think there's an argument that, we're this week that we're talking, Microsoft and Google have announced that they're adding AI to a bunch of their productivity suites and Google Docs and Word. And I think it's interesting to think about, I'm sure there will be, when we're talking 10 years from now, incredibly large and successful and influential companies that are being built in 2023 around AI applications, but they're going to have to be very clever to beat the built-in distribution of Microsoft Office 365 or Google Workspace. Otherwise, it's going to be the same story as a Slack and Microsoft Teams, outcome where Teams just had the distribution and was able to beat Slack, even though Slack's a better product. So it'll be interesting to see. I think to answer your question, I think every sector is ripe for reinvention, but it's going to take a bit of focus probably to actually build best-in-class products and defensibility to beat the incumbents.
Yeah. I heard Mr. Beast recently raised a round at over a unicorn valuation. I'm curious how you think the creator ecosystem might evolve over the next few years, maybe starting with fundraising. Do you think creators are going to raise rounds like that? Are going to look like 360 deals basically? Are there going to be other funding models? Are we sort of like where the startup ecosystem was in the 90s or something before the influx of venture capital? Like, how do you think about that?
I think, when I put my investor hat on, there's an incredible sort of key person risk with these companies. We just saw that with Yeezy and Kanye West and Adidas. So I think, that's the flip side. I think companies like Fenty and Skims have done a really good job separating themselves a little bit from the persona behind it. They're now about much more than Kim and Rihanna, and their ad campaigns include a lot of other people. I think the more interesting trend here is I'm not as interested in the whales like that. I think there are a lot that they can do, but they're probably not going to be the next, iconic $10 billion companies. I think what's really interesting to me is this broader shift of more people thinking like business owners and thinking like entrepreneurs. And so what are the platforms for the next generation of entrepreneurship or small business creation? And going back to our conversation about Gen Z, I've seen a number of studies and stats that differ, but usually there's something like 60, 70, 80% of people under 20 that are pooled want to start their own company or be their own business owner. I think few of those will probably be your traditional venture-backed startup, but a lot of them will be small businesses, or people are freelancers, or they find their own clever way to do something online. Like stories that I often look to are this woman who calls herself Miss Excel, who literally has an Excel training course and sells it for a couple $100 and then makes TikTok videos about Excel. And I think she makes like many thousands of dollars a day now selling this and travels the world doing it. That's one example where no one will be like, Excel creator is a job. Another one is this woman who is a professional reseller on Depop, and she kind of curates her closet and sells goods and sells outfit recommendations to people. And, these are jobs that you just wouldn't think to exist 10 years ago, let alone things like Discord community manager, or even, Figma community just launched and you can, build apps and widgets there and sell them. So I think all of those are just really interesting to me. They might not be $10 billion companies or raise the Mr. Beast level price, but what are the different platforms that undergird that new economy?
To that end, there are a number of people who have a passion project that is resonating with an audience that they would probably love to go full-time on. Do you think that there will be a platform that enables them to kind of fundraise from their audience? Maybe this exists already, or that kind of at scale that also gives the audience upside in what they're doing? Is this also the promise of NFTs? Or like, how do you think about that?
I do like the idea of more grassroots kind of community participation, sort of like a Kickstarter 2.0 concept. I think that when we think of these ideas, we often think about them when they work and it's exciting. I think the tricky part comes when most businesses fail and your community loses money on you, or things like that. And so I think there's probably a lot to work out around the structuring and economics of it. There is a broad trend of, angel investing becoming more accessible to people, and the rules around accredited investors changing and being more flexible. So I do think that's exciting, in that fewer people have been able to participate in the equity markets in some ways. And most people in America are hourly workers or salary workers who don't have that kind of economic upside. And so there's something interesting there to figure out to make it a little accessible to people to access that upside, but it should be done in a very kind of safeguarded way. And I haven't seen the right model, and I'm not sure what it would look like.
Blake Robbins has this concept I'm sure you've seen called the full-time fan, which I'm really intrigued by, this idea that people could earn economic, not to mention social status benefits from discovering people early and supporting them and spreading their work. And the more we enable full-time fans, the more, you'll enable full-time creators as well.
Yeah, I mean, I always use the example of Taylor Swift because I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan, and today happens to be the day that she's launching her Eras tour. But, I was a fan back in kind of like 2006, 2007, and I'm sure if I had some economic participation in her upside and had bet on her, I would have, done quite well for myself. I think that's interesting. My hunch is that it would be a smaller share of someone's income. I think the way that income streams are shifting is they're shifting to being more multimodal. And sort of what I mean by that is, in the past 50 years, someone had their kind of one career, their one primary income stream. They got their gold watch from their corporation for their loyalty. And that shifted a lot. And now we see young people change jobs every 2 years, every 3 years. And I think the next iteration of that is actually just having a bunch of different tributaries of income. And so maybe you make some of your income by being a fan for someone and supporting them and running their Stan account on Twitter. Maybe you make some of your income, for managing their Discord, or for making YouTube videos, or writing a Substack, or all of these kind of clever ways that people are finding to make income. But my view is that people will probably stitch together a bunch of different sources of income, and hopefully some of them are passive, which when I talk to young people, passive income is really the holy grail for them. But my view is that's kind of the future of the economy, this more kind of digitally native, fluid, multifaceted income stream.
If you had to make a prediction as to what platform might emerge to help enable some of the trends that we're talking about, or take into, serve some of the trends that we're talking about, what that you're thinking about potentially as an investor, or maybe if it's not venture backable, but what would you predict?
That's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of really interesting companies that emerge for these kinds of things. I think some in the later stage, Pietra is a company that lets anyone launch their own product line, which is interesting. WAP is a company that is lesser known. It's WHOP, but essentially it lets you launch your own kind of digital product business and manage that. So, I have a friend who, we're talking about passive income here. He basically, I live here in New York, where Resi kind of rules the restaurant scene. So the rest of the country is probably more open table dependent, but here in New York, all of the best restaurants, your Carbones, et cetera, are on Resi. But it's very challenging when a reservation opens to a Carbone-like place. They go right away, and the tables are all scooped up. And so he built this bot that you install, and basically it can comb the reservations on Resi and claim tables for you. And he sells it for like $15 a month or something. And, that's an example of a kind of digital business, like a software bot or IP proxy or community that you would sell on a place like WAP. But I think that's an interesting example of kind of a future income for someone, where it might not be your full income, but you built this thing that you don't really have to tend to or manage, and it's bringing you in some decent income each week. That is very interesting. And I think when you talk to young people who grew up surrounded by technology and immersed in it, those are the kinds of passion projects that they see as very kind of potentially high upside in their economic life as well.
Yeah. And platforms like Contra or Polywork are also trying to take into account kind of the multi-hyphenated or multifaceted work life of it.
They are, yeah. I think platforms for freelancers are interesting in that way. Of course, Fiverr was a much more successful business than I thought it would be at the time, but it's gotten quite large, and others like that. I think the challenge with those that you mentioned, they certainly originated as more LinkedIn competitors, and I think of the social networks, LinkedIn is probably the most difficult to disrupt in my view. It has some very strong network effects, and I think some crazy engagement stats on how often people are using it. And of course, they have recruiters reliant on them. So even though it feels very stale, I think it's difficult to disrupt. But I do think that there are these interesting infrastructure layers to this new economy we're talking about.
Yeah. Why is it so difficult to disrupt it? It shouldn't feel that way, right? It's just a bunch of resumes, and like, how much commitment do I really have to LinkedIn versus like maybe Twitter, where I've built up my followership, and would I really leave that? I'm never going to build up my followership again. And I know LinkedIn has introduced followership as well, but why is LinkedIn so difficult to disrupt relative to other social platforms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm trying to think live about this, and part of my view is that LinkedIn is interesting because it monetizes more diversely than most of the other social networks. So like Facebook, Snap, 99% of their revenues from ads. LinkedIn has a few major buckets, but one of the main ones is recruiting solutions, basically, where recruiters pay. And of course, they also have ads. I think partly that's it. It's more a professional tool for the people who are dictating how labor moves in our market, at least for more higher paying kind of white collar jobs. And so that's one thought. It really just is ingrained. It almost is like Salesforce in that way of, it's not necessarily a good product, but being able to use LinkedIn Sales Navigator or Salesforce is a tool. It's a skill that recruiters and people in HR know. So that's one thought. Other thought is, of course, it just has very strong network effects of, if you're starting a new platform and everyone's on LinkedIn and all the jobs are on LinkedIn, and it's tough to get going. And so that's one piece of it. Some of the vertical versions I think are interesting around LinkedIn leaves some gaps that could be solved by more specific verticals. So, it's not very good for people who are freelancers or who don't have the kind of traditional careers of the past. So maybe there's an opportunity there, but I don't know. It is really a monolith kind of in the recruiting world.
Yeah, that's well said. We've touched on it, but I want to hear more in detail of your thoughts on NFTs and what will be their kind of overriding impact. I know people ascribe a lot of things to NFTs, but where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think the problem with blockchain and crypto is sort of in the hype cycles of the last few years, it got ahead of its skis in terms of the froth. And unfortunately, that obfuscated the fact that I think there are really interesting use cases for the technology. We talked about this ability to, whether it's like a token that shows you are an early fan, or this traceability I think is interesting. The problem is that one, the technology is not quite there. Two, of course, it was used for different use cases. So I think there's something interesting there. I think NFTs are still interesting down the road. My view has always been that a lot of the crypto elements won't be visible to actually the end users. And so it'll be much more kind of underneath the surface. Maybe it lives on blockchain, but on the application, people don't actually know that. And so I think that probably is still a few years away. And it's not going to be, the JPEGs of apes and things like that. I think it'll be much more tied to utility.
Yeah, it is interesting. There was this version of the world that one could imagine taking place where we were just going to be speculating on everything, where it's not just companies, but it's people's social media accounts. It's you tie kind of everything to a stock market almost somehow. And do you think that is way overblown, or like where do you think that's go? There were some people that experimented with personal tokens that would rise based on sentiment. Like, how do you see that behavior evolving?
I do think that I've thought a lot about this trend of kind of what you're saying, the financialization of everything, and I do think that's true. I think it also has flavors in what we've talked about around people thinking of themselves as their own business or their owners or entrepreneurs, and being much more kind of self-directed and autonomous and wanting to capture their own economic upside. I do think that in a bear market, it's a harder trend because not everything's up and to the right. There's this kind of viral TikTok that went around a week or two ago, which was it resurfaced this couple from about a year ago talking about how they weren't working. They were just making a living day trading. And the guy was like, oh, my philosophy is that, when I see a stock going up, I buy it, and then I hold as it continues to go up, and then I sell. And we made $40,000 this month doing this. And, a lot of people were making fun of this as sort of the emblem of the zero interest rate phenomenon. And, I feel bad I don't know how those people have done now, but it can have done well with the market going down. And I think that a lot of people did get used to this world where everything was up and to the right. And that was true with, crypto and Dogecoin and Bored Apes and like all of these crazy phenomena from the last few years. But I think the underlying trends of people wanting to dictate their own economic fortunes because they're skeptical of institutions and skeptical of capitalism in general, those are not going away. But the way that they've manifested the last few years, that was a bit of a bubble.
I agree with everything you said. I'd also add, that gambling is pretty addicting. Yeah. And people enjoy gambling. And so gambling, speculating, if there are more opportunities to speculate, people are probably going to do that.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think a lot of gamified technology products have always played on that.
Putting our venture hats on, the last time we spoke on the podcast, it was 2021. And the creator economy was kind of having a renaissance in the venture world. Then Legion had the passion economy. And is it fair to say, I'm curious for us to reflect on that. Is it fair to say that most of the gains have been accrued by the platforms and maybe the creators themselves? Or how do we sort of take stock of the creator economy sort of, phase in the last few years?
I think, again, I try not to use that term as much because I do think that it makes people think of a more narrower business model or use case. And so I think, more broadly around like, what does it actually mean at its core? It's like people earning a living based on their own specialized knowledge or interests or creativity or art. It's a broader trend. And I think it certainly was easier when, in a bull market where people were earning a lot of income and companies were flush with cash to, experiment on these creator funds, whether it's TikTok or Snap or Facebook or all of these kind of ways of people trying out new ways to win the war of talent online. That's certainly gone away a bit. I think the platforms have always monopolized a lot of the value for themselves. Very few of them have actually been very friendly to the people building on them. I think, YouTube is certainly the exception in that it is really the one place to monetize if you're a real traditional quote unquote creator. That said, I mean, just over the last 5 or 10 years, we've had dozens of platforms come up that I would call, digitally native work platforms, creator platforms, whatever you want to call them. I mean, I think there are really interesting ones where you can be, you can work for Overwolf, which is a gaming company in Israel that lets you build in-game apps and mods. That can be a living. You can work for, Leland is a new startup that lets you be a coach. So if you are a career coach or have some sort of expertise to share. Nourish is a company I think is really interesting, which is a seed stage company that lets you be, as a consumer, connect to a dietitian. And as a dietitian, you can actually be employed to do these digital consults with people who are curious to learn about their health and wellness. Similar company in the therapy space is Headway. And so, these are more kind of not what you would consider creator jobs, but they're new forms of work that didn't exist 5 years ago. I mean, if I was a therapist, I would probably have to go through a lot of legal red tape and ropes to get insured and get started. And I didn't have this turnkey solution to join Headway and be able to have online consultations. Same with, as a dietitian, which is a quite well-paying job that a lot of young people are very interested in. There weren't these solutions that let me just have that as my way to earn a living like there are now, let alone a lot of the companies we've talked about, like WAP, where I can actually just build a software bot and earn passive income by managing my business there. So, I am very bullish on this long trend of these platforms that allow you to connect with people in new ways, to have new openings and avenues for monetization, and this kind of digital economy that's still pretty new. And AI might blow that open and have even more ways to monetize or supercharge your own powers. But that's kind of the arc that excites me more so than a lot of the Snap Spotlight or TikTok or YouTube headlines of the last few years. It's more the up and coming platforms that let you dictate your own fortunes in a new way.
Yeah. Well, to that end, it said that every generation has its new social media platform because they want to separate themselves. Is TikTok that of Gen Z, or is TikTok more entertainment and less of social media platform? Like, how do you think about consumer social going forward? If there's anything that excites you?
Yeah, I think about consumer social and commerce in similar ways, actually. To use the consumer social example, I mean, I think about this march from less rich media formats to more rich. So if you think of blogs and Twitter as the early examples of really just text, 140 characters and then 280 characters. So that was that. And then Instagram came along and photos were the next thing. And now we're in a video era where certainly TikTok has popularized that with short form, but everyone else is really throwing all of their resources into video, including Instagram and Meta writ large. So that has been the path. I think it will continue. What is the next iteration of that? Probably more immersive formats like 3D worlds. That could be a Minecraft or Roblox or Fortnite like experience. It could be, there are a few companies building MMOs in the browser, which I think is very interesting because it's more accessible to people and easier to build and create things. And that's a way to socialize with friends. Ultimately, I'm very bullish on VR and AR. I think that it is a matter of when, not if. I think we'll look back and laugh at how long it took, and that it took us a lot longer than we expected, and we were wrong on timing, but we weren't wrong on actually how powerful those technologies would be. I always like the Tim Sweeney quote, "I've never met a skeptic of VR who's tried it." And it really is an incredible technology, but it probably needs a better device, and the headsets aren't there yet, and it probably needs some killer apps as well. But ultimately, my view is that the next big social platform will look more like a game. It'll look more like a Roblox or Minecraft than it does an Instagram or TikTok. And similarly, in commerce, I think we'll move to more immersive forms of shopping, whether it's, Whatnot and live stream or new kind of creative things like that.
It seems that a trend that we've been talking about in this podcast is that the internet is fragmenting a bit so that more people can find people just like them. And what maybe that means, reading between the lines, is that a lot of these platforms that exist to serve these kind of increasingly, smaller niches, that maybe they're not venture scale. Like maybe there needs to be different funding models to take into account kind of this nicheification of the internet. Would you dispute that premise? And if not, what do you think needs to happen?
I wouldn't dispute it. I mean, I think that it is not a good thing that venture is often thought of as the single way to build a company. I don't think it's the right way to build a company for most entrepreneurs. I think that incentives are misaligned. I mean, it's a power law business. It works for a certain type of entrepreneur, a certain type of product, a certain type of market. But the backbone of America has always been small business creation. I think what's interesting now with this sort of online economy is a lot of these companies we've talked about undergird other forms of business creation. So an example would be from the last decade, my partner has worked at Fair for 5 or 6 years, something like that, but from the early days. And he works in product there. And, Fair is not a consumer facing company, but it's B2B2C in that it arms these small businesses, these retailers around the country and now around the world to have their business, have it thrive, connect with artisans and brands. And that's a very powerful model. And I think we're going to see new kind of online versions of that as well. So the biggest companies are often not necessarily the ones that are the small businesses themselves. To your point, those probably shouldn't be venture funded, but they're the ones that are the platforms upon which business creation happens.
One thing you're really attuned to is demographic changes. And we've been talking a bunch about Gen Z. One other demographic change that I see is interesting is, and I'm sure there's equivalent on the male side, but on the female side, I heard recently that over 48% of women over 40 won't have children. Some of them might be married, some of them are partnered, some of them might not be. And I'm curious, and they're also the biggest spenders, or they have a lot of discretionary income. To the extent that that is true, do you think that what businesses might exist to enable that change in behavior?
It's an interesting question. I think those kinds of broad demographic and behavior changes are interesting to me. I didn't know that stat. I think there are a lot of interesting companies building solutions for women to have kids later. So, to better track their fertility and maternity journeys. And I think there are also interesting tailwinds in surrogacy and things like that, where it might be more common for people to use surrogates and stay in the workforce, or this sort of popularization of that model. Didn't know that they weren't having kids. I mean, I do see among young people a much greater sort of interest in a kid-free life. I think, what do they call it on TikTok? There's this trend of like people self-proclaiming themselves dinks, which DINK, which stands for double income, no kids. And people are like, I choose the dink life, the dink life is what I want. And part of it, I think, comes from looking around the world and people being like, oh, like climate change and all these terrible things happening. Like, I'm just going to enjoy life and not bring kids into it. They might change their view in 10 or 20 years, who knows? But it is an interesting trend, because how do people spend time? How do they spend their money, to your point? How do they interact with other people and find other forms of community and belonging? So, offshoots off the top of my head would be, maybe ripple effects are people don't feel tied down geographically to live in one place. And so there's more kind of short-term living or nomadic life, digital nomads, which might mean that more people want to work remotely. Maybe another after effect is that people look for more kind of community interests and activities. And so they need to find belonging in other ways. Other examples would be, how people maybe want to like reinvent themselves and find fulfillment in their education and go back to school or change careers. So it is interesting to think about how our society, I'm fascinated in social constructs of, just the way that things are that we take for granted. And certainly the normal inertia that we feel in American society of turning 30 and having kids and settling down and living in one place and all of these kinds of things we take for granted. When we start to question them, those are when the biggest businesses, I think, are built, when you start to wonder about what if things don't have to be this way, and then you start to change culture.
Totally. I think it's a great note to wrap on. In closing, for entrepreneurs listening to this who are looking to evaluate like different white space, maybe related to topics we've talked about, or certain rabbit holes to go down, is there anything that's top of mind for you in terms of what if you could clone yourself as an entrepreneur and say, hey, I would explore this space. There seems to be something intriguing here related to something we spoke about, or not related. Is there anything you'd?
I think what I would say is solve the problems that you've experienced. I think there are often problems. Few great companies I know were built when people went out looking for a problem, or sometimes we call them like PowerPoint founders, or like, you're market mapping and you're looking for something that you think is an opportunity to build because you want to build a business. I think the most special and iconic generational companies are built when people build things that they themselves want to see in the world, or that they've experienced, or at least that they have some connection to that keeps them motivated. Because, startups are hard. You're going to go through a lot of rough patches. What's going to keep you motivated through those and inspired that the world needs this? So I think it's more about, thinking through, some of these trends that you can think high level, and of course should be smart around, this is where the world's going, this is a growing market or opportunity. but also just being very passionate about a specific problem. And, solving that problem, you might be able to expand it and, add on other products or grow the market. So don't be dissuaded by the opportunity today. I would say just build an excellent problem that solves the problem that you think needs to be solved.
Yeah, that's a great place to wrap on. My guest has been Rex Woodbury. The Substack is digital native. It's a must read. And if you're building anything interesting, Index and Rex would be great partners to you. Rex, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. It's always a fun conversation.